A house torn down. A flag folded tight. They thought he was just an old man, but they didn't know that land belonged to someone who kept his last promise to his son. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, because the moment he raised the photo above the ruins was when America had to face itself. The roar of the excavator tore through the quiet morning in Woodridge Springs. Henry Whitmore, 74, still seated in his wheelchair, hadn't even poured his morning tea when his roof came crashing down in front of him. One cold mechanical strike hit the porch corner, the spot where a photo once hung of him and his son, Sergeant James Whitmore, recently killed on duty in Syria. "What the hell are you doing?" Henry's choked scream cut through the rising dust. He couldn't hear the reply from the man in a suit, clipboard in hand, standing next to the HOA's orange-labeled demolition vehicle. Woodridge Springs HOA, the same group he'd paid dues to faithfully for 11 years. Except for the last 2 months when he was burying his son. Property seized under Clause 14, 3 delinquent payment beyond the grace period. Internal ruling issued last month. The man read it out like a machine. His eyes were blank. No emotion. The excavator roared again. More shingles broke away. More of Henry's roof collapsed. Neighbors began pouring out. Mrs. Jenkins across the street screamed when she saw him. "Oh God, he's still in there!" A young woman pointed her phone live streaming. "They're tearing down a disabled veteran's house. He's in a wheelchair." No warning, no notice. Henry reached for his old rescue horn, an award from his firefighting days, now clipped beside his chair. But his hand trembled so badly he dropped it. The floor beneath cracked tile was crumbling, the air thick with smoke and dust. But his eyes never left the photo of his son, now lying shattered in the grass frame, cracked down the middle. "Stop, stop, right now," a man's voice cut in, urgent, sharp. Tommy West, former Marine, 2 houses down. He charged through the cloud, pulled Henry from the wreck just as the roof caved in behind them, like a scene out of a war film. Henry sat still, silent, his lips pressed tight. His face pale as ash. What was left on the lawn was nothing but broken boards, splintered photo frames, and a dirt-covered wheelchair. The remains of a home once shared by a father and his fallen soldier son. 4 minutes later, the police arrived. Not to stop the demolition, but to escort the crew safely. Tommy stepped between the squad car and Henry. He's a retired firefighter, father of a damn hero. "And you, who are you protecting?" the police chief shrugged. Avoided Tommy's stare. "We're just following orders. The HOA has the proper paperwork." In Henry's hands, the only notice was a black and white flyer, unsigned, unstamped, slid under his kitchen window. 2 weeks ago. "I thought it was junk mail," he muttered, barely above a whisper. By noon, the story was all over Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit. One photo went viral. Henry slumped in his wheelchair, amid the rubble, holding the cracked frame of his son's photo, his eyes sunken and shut. Behind him, on a half-standing wall, an old poster still clung. "Support our troops. United we stand." Right next to it, the cold blue logo of the Woodridge Springs HOA, upholding community excellence. From that moment, America began to split in two. Within just 12 hours, a single furious tweet with the hashtag #JusticeForHenry had gone viral across the country. Hundreds of thousands of shares flooded timelines. Local news stations picked it up first. Then CNN, Fox, even YouTubers who specialize in exposing HOAs jumped in. But while social media boiled over by the hour, back at Woodridge Springs HOA headquarters, Board President Valerie Granger held a press conference with the calm of someone explaining a power outage, not the demolition of a veteran's home. "We regret that Mr. Henry happened to be inside during demolition," she said, voice flat. "But legally, we followed protocol and issued prior notice. Rules are rules." Reporters fired back on the spot. He was arranging a military funeral for his son, a soldier killed in action. "Did anyone on your board consider that timing?" Valerie didn't blink. "We cannot manage the personal circumstances of every resident. If we make exceptions for one who follows the rules." That line cold clinical was clipped and shared like wildfire, while Granger sat behind a microphone and a cup of black coffee. Henry remained in a spare room at the local church where neighbors had taken shifts cooking for him, doing his laundry, even rebuilding his broken wheelchair. He didn't cry, but he never let go of a small silvered envelope. The one from the Department of Defense, the one that delivered the news of his son's death, still bearing the faint print of Henry's thumb from the day he opened it. And then old images began to surface. Henry years ago, wearing his firefighter uniform, Battling the school blaze of '89, Henry walking little James by the 9/11 memorial fence, a child raised in the smoke of rescue who became a man lost in a distant war. And now both father and son discarded like line items in some HOA spreadsheet, nameless rows in a lifeless system built on dues and deadlines. That night, Tommy and a group of fellow veterans pitched tents right on the demolished lot. They raised a banner. "This is a father's land, not a corporate zone." Student journalists from the local university brought speakers and went live. When police arrived citing concerns for public order, the crowd stayed silent, holding photos of James with signs that read, "He died for freedom, but his father wasn't free in his own home." At the same time, an independent investigation quietly launched on a legal community forum. An anonymous user uploaded scanned pages of the HOA contract for Woodridge Springs and flagged something off. The enforcement clause had no clear time frame and no requirement to prove a notice had actually been received, meaning the HOA could slide a flyer under a window and call it official notice. That night in a dim church guest room, Henry couldn't sleep. He sat staring at the old radio that once belonged to his son, softly playing the national anthem. He wasn't angry. He didn't shout. He just kept thinking one sentence over and over. He died to protect freedom for others. So why don't I have the right to protect my own roof? 3 days after the house was torn down, the Denver Chronicle dropped its first bombshell behind the pretty homes, when HOAs become a tool of force. The article didn't just focus on Henry. It laid bare a pattern, a quiet history of people pushed out, punished, or erased by Woodridge Springs, HOA, a widow threatened with property, seizure for installing windows the wrong shade of beige, a single dad fined weekly because his delivery truck lingered past curfew, and one man evicted for planting his state flag on the lawn. That man, a Vietnam veteran once imprisoned for serving under false orders, later exonerated. None of these stories had sparked outrage at the time. Most victims were too poor or too exhausted to fight back. But this time with Henry, the silence broke, especially after the Chronicle revealed a jaw-dropping detail. Henry had submitted a request to extend his HOA payment on time with a postal stamp to prove it, but the letter never arrived. A photo in the article showed the unopened envelope returned and stamped by a regional mail center. Undeliverable, address unclear. The twist, the address Henry wrote was correct, every single letter, which meant someone may have interfered with the HOA's incoming mail. As public outrage exploded, the HOA dug in. Valerie Granger appeared in a statewide TV interview. Her voice ice cold, her tone robotic. "We're sorry if paperwork was lost in transit, but we cannot be held responsible for the federal postal system." Dumont or Whitmore violated the terms, and the organization was obligated to act in the interest of the community. Within hours, the hashtag #Granger must resign surged into the national top 5 on Twitter. In a veterans forum, someone reposted a photo of James Henry's son cradling an injured Syrian child. The caption read, "We send our children off to war, only to return home and watch their fathers' homes destroyed by unelected boards." In Woodridge Springs, resistance grew. House by house, residents began flying mourning flags from porches. Handmade signs appeared. No more HOA. Here, people boycotted every HOA meeting. On the neighborhood's central bulletin board, someone taped a sheet of paper in bold black ink. They brought down a roof, but they just dug the foundation for their own collapse. And then came Marcus Caldwell, a young attorney, former prosecutor, grandson of one of Henry's longtime neighbors. He stood on the rubble where the house once stood and made a promise. "I will represent Mr. Whitmore free of charge for as long as this case takes." He looked into the crowd. This is not about money, not just a house. This is about dignity, about the right of people to exist right where they've given everything to belong. And we will not let anyone crush that with a bulldozer or a fine print clause. The crowd didn't cheer right away. They stood quiet, then came the applause. Not because he was eloquent, but because for the first time someone was really standing up for them. That night in her private inbox, Valerie Granger received an anonymous email. Just one line. "Someone's digging through the HOA's financials. Are you sure you cleaned everything up?" 2 days after Marcus Caldwell's declaration, the mayor's office of Centennial received over 2,000 petition signatures demanding a full investigation into the financial practices and civil enforcement actions of the Woodridge Springs HOA. The signatures came from everywhere. Veterans, longtime residents, new homeowners, even people from other neighborhoods who'd been punished in similar ways. The political pressure started to build. County council members were forced to hold an emergency hearing, a public forum where the people could finally speak. The live broadcast drew over 400,000 viewers in just the first 2 hours. At the hearing, Henry was wheeled up to the podium. Tommy had reinforced the chair with a makeshift aluminum frame. Henry's voice was weak but steady. Each word hit like a blade. "I'm not here to ask for my house back. I'm here to ask why the law in this town lets someone destroy a man's life without even knocking first." In the seats below, Valerie Granger sat with her arms folded, expression blank, but her fingers tapped a relentless rhythm on the table. When it was her turn to respond, she said nothing about Henry. She repeated bylaws, cited steps taken, then concluded, "We made no mistake. The mistake is a system that's grown too tolerant of delay and excuses." The room fell silent, not in agreement but in anticipation. Everyone could feel it. A collapse was coming, and it came faster than expected. Later that same day, an investigative reporter from KNCB-TV broke a new story. 3 companies contracted for HOA cleanup, construction, and demolition were all linked to Valerie Granger's extended family. 2 of them had previous lawsuits for fraudulent billing in other neighborhoods, and the contract to demolish Henry's home signed it within 24 hours. No bidding process. At the same time, Marcus received a tip from an anonymous insider at the HOA. At least 12 other enforcement cases had been quietly buried, marked as lost records. That same day, the Veterans of Foreign Wars VFW issued a national statement urging the Department of Housing and Urban Development HUD to investigate HOAs for unchecked authority and lack of oversight. A full-blown crisis was forming. But on the other side, the HOA refused to back down. Valerie Granger sent Marcus a legal notice, accusing him of defamation against a civil institution and demanding damages for reputational harm. The press called it a desperate counterattack. Marcus just laughed. "If they think a threat letter will scare me, they've clearly never gone up against a veteran who once sued the federal government for the right to be buried next to her husband and won." Meanwhile, another viral video swept across social media. Henry standing among rubble, lifting his son's photo frame into the air. The caption read, "We are not afraid of the HOA. Because my son taught me freedom is never asked for." It's defended. That moment marked the end of the beginning. Because from here on out, this wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about what a community does when the law becomes a weapon used to crush the people it was meant to protect. Early the next morning, Marcus and his team of volunteers received an anonymous call, a man's voice low stuttering like it came from inside a concrete bunker with weak signal. "Check Henry's enforcement file at the City Land Records office. There's another version not matching what the HOA released." The line went dead. No hesitation, Marcus and Tommy jumped in the truck and drove straight to the municipal center. After nearly 3 hours of digging through mislabeled folders and misfiled boxes, they found a document misfiled under infrastructure reports instead of civil enforcement. It was a site condition inspection report for Henry's house. It clearly stated no signs of structural decay, no collapse risk, no architectural violations, only maintenance fee, paperwork pending. The date, 5 weeks before the demolition. The person who signed it, a city engineer not affiliated with the HOA translation. The demolition had no legal basis, no critical deterioration, no public risk, no confirmed hazardous violations. Marcus snapped photos of everything, sent them to a fellow attorney on the team, and called the Denver Chronicle's lead investigative reporter. That night, Spotlight at 7 opened with a single damning sentence. A disabled former firefighter's home was destroyed by an HOA that had no justification. And hid the evidence, Valerie Granger stayed silent for 24 hours, then reappeared on a conservative talk show, accusing the media of manipulation and Marcus of inciting unrest against a lawful institution. Marcus responded calmly. He would be filing formal charges in district court next week, alleging abuse of authority, illegal property seizure, and destruction of private assets without due process. Included in the filing, a newly uncovered clip from a neighbor's security camera, a member of the HOA board quietly entering the community office and replacing the posted enforcement notice 3 days before the bulldozers came. That man, Eric Lowell, vice president of the HOA, and Valerie Granger's husband's cousin. When the video spread, the residents of Woodridge Springs finally dropped the silence. A spontaneous community meeting formed on the neighborhood's central lawn. People brought folding chairs, flashlights, baked pies, and printed copies of their property contracts. At a wooden table under a street lamp, neighbors signed a joint declaration. We demand a full investigation of the HOA, immediate suspension of all enforcements and fee collections. More than 200 signatures. Then a woman stood up, her voice shaky but steady. I used to think the HOA was here to protect stability, but now I realize what kind of stability needs threats, lies, and bulldozers to survive. That moment was broadcast on national morning shows the next day. At the same time, an internal HOA email was leaked. Subject line, "We need to deal with Henry fast before it triggers a chain reaction." Sender Valerie, recipient the entire HOA board. And suddenly a question started echoing through headlines and talk shows across the country. Henry might just be the beginning. But what is it that the HOA is really afraid of? News of the hidden report, the swap notice footage, and Valerie's leaked email sent the public into full-blown outrage. But the real earthquake hit Monday afternoon when a representative from Congresswoman Linda McAdams' office, Colorado's state delegate, stepped up to the podium and declared, "We are requesting a federal hearing to examine the unchecked power and oversight mechanisms of homeowners associations nationwide." It was the first time in history that a neighborhood HOA dispute had reached the level of a national congressional inquiry. The media quickly branded it the Woodridge case. And Henry, the man in the wheelchair, sitting quietly among rubble, became the face of a rising resistance against silence in the face of institutional injustice. In a short NBC interview, he spoke only one line: "I don't need attention. I just need a quiet home to remember my son." Back in Woodridge Springs, the atmosphere shifted by the hour. Half the residents had torn down their HOA signs. New banners appeared. Self-governed, no HOA. People who had stayed silent for years began telling their own stories. Fined for flying their state flag, penalized for leaving their trash bins 6 inches off mark, cited because their adopted child's ethnicity clashed with the neighborhood profile. Henry's story had cracked something open. This wasn't about one house anymore. It was about a hidden power structure quietly creeping into every American neighborhood. But Valerie Granger still didn't flinch. In another internal email she wrote to the board, "This is temporary noise. The crowd will tire. The press will move on. We just have to hold our line." She was wrong. That night, 60 Minutes aired a 12-minute segment, "Who Really Controls American Neighborhoods?" The investigative team revealed a sprawling web of law firms, construction, contractors, and private investors, backing dozens of HOAs, pulling in millions through compounded fines, forced enforcements, and even auctioning seized homes. In Woodridge Springs alone, the report showed that over 5 years, 9 properties had been seized, 7 of which were sold to a real estate firm directly connected to one man, Valerie Granger's husband. The news shook the nation, a civil rights organization called it. A corporate dictatorship disguised in neighborhood law. A new hashtag began trending, HOA Gate. A former senator went live and didn't mince words. "This is a mafia in blazers." While public fury boiled over, Tommy and Marcus organized a memorial vigil at the site where Henry's house once stood on what would have been James's 29th birthday. Under candlelight and flags, people shared stories of James, how he pulled a wounded child out of gunfire, how he sent every paycheck home to help his father with medical bills. In the hush that followed, Henry finally cried. He didn't speak. He just placed a trembling hand on the cracked soil, right where his son's living room used to be. And then, from the back row, a man slowly rose to speak. He introduced himself, Douglas Linney, former internal auditor for the Woodridge HOA, until he was fired 3 years ago for being out of alignment with direction. His voice was clear, unshaken. "I know why Henry was targeted. I know why his home was picked first, and I have the documents, but I'll only hand them over when there's a formal hearing and I'm allowed to speak," without using their microphone. Silence fell over the entire field. Henry stared at the man for a long moment, then gave a slow, steady nod. No one knew what Douglas was about to reveal, but everyone understood one thing. Tonight, what we're building back isn't just a house, it's a front line. 3 days after Douglas Linney's vow, Congresswoman Linda McAdams' office officially announced a special hearing at Centennial City Hall. 2 central questions would guide it: the legality of HOA enforcement actions across the state, financial manipulation and internal conflicts of interest within HOA operations. Douglas was called as a key witness, and as promised, he arrived carrying a hardshell briefcase stuffed with paper files and a full digital backup. Inside, dozens of emails, confidential board memos, shady internal agreements. But the document that shook the room was this: a behavioral risk index list, an internal HOA watch list flagging residents by categories: uncooperative attitude, no family ties within community, non-compliant tendencies, low legal resistance potential. According to metadata, the list was created by Valerie Granger herself back in 2020, and right there at the top of priority level 1, Henry Whitmore. But the most disturbing part, this data wasn't pulled from formal documents. It was compiled through field observation maintenance staff reports and even private HOA volunteer group chats. They called it community disruption risk scoring. When this document hit the projector screen at the hearing, the chamber erupted. Congresswoman McAdams had to bang the gavel 3 times to restore order. Valerie Granger by then had refused to attend, citing personal safety concerns. She sent her lawyer instead, but things got worse. 2 current HOA board members, Sharon Wells and Dean Porter, suddenly stood up from the gallery. They requested to speak, then publicly resigned on the spot. Sharon's voice trembled but didn't falter. Valerie manipulated the organization. She signed off shady contracts, and she threatened anyone who disagreed. They submitted audio recordings from internal meetings, in one of which Valerie said plainly, "If we let people like Henry speak up, this HOA loses control. We either clean them out or get swept away ourselves." Marcus sat beside Henry, his hand gripped tight. It wasn't anger in his chest anymore. It was clarity. This wouldn't be one with rage. This would be one with truth and collapse from within. That night, the Woodridge Springs community held a non-binding civil vote, a bold gesture to freeze all HOA collections and enforcements until investigations were complete. It had no immediate legal force, but 89% of the neighborhood signed it. They didn't need a judge to know an HOA only has power if people agree to follow. The media called it America's first silent homeowner rebellion. Then at exactly midnight, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I helped process the order on Henry's house. I know it was rushed. If you want testimony, come to Longridge Construction. Site after 9 p.m. tomorrow. Come alone." Marcus sat in silence, reading the message again and again. He didn't speak. He just turned his head to look at Henry, asleep under a wool blanket, his hand still holding a worn photo of his son. "There are battles you fight in court, and some you fight in the dark." 900 p.m. The Longridge construction site, an isolated development zone on the western edge of Woodridge Springs, sat in near total darkness. Just one flickering street lamp cast a shaky beam across a road coated in cement dust, while crickets chirped in the background like a low warning signal. Marcus arrived right on time. Alone, no phone, just a small voice recorder tucked into his coat pocket. The man waiting leaned against an old pickup truck. Ball cap pulled low over his face, wearing a construction jacket with no name tag. "I don't have much time," he said, voice dry and brittle. "I supervise the demolition crew on Henry's house. I don't know everything, but there's something you need to see." He handed Marcus a crumpled folder. Inside was a demolition contract, digitally signed, but the timestamp was suspicious. 9 a.m., just 6 hours before the bulldozers arrived. Worse, the attached safety clearance report was a PDF file created after the contract had already been signed. "So they signed the order before the permit even existed?" Marcus asked. The man nodded, glancing around constantly. "I'm no hero, just a guy doing his job. But the way they rushed it, how fast they wiped the records after, I haven't been able to sleep." Marcus pulled out the recorder. "I need you to say that again if you're willing." The man stood silent for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Just make sure you scramble my voice. My family still lives here." After a 17-minute meeting, Marcus left with a recording, a copy of the original contract, and a name whispered as they parted: Thomas Wendell, head accountant of the HOA and the last person to touch the paperwork before the order was processed. The next morning, as the hearing entered its 3rd day, Marcus stood before the public and the press and played the recording. The chamber tensed. Henry sat behind him, unblinking. The voice rang out, nervous but clear. "We got orders from Eric Lowell. The excavator was scheduled before the contract was official. Someone made it clear, get it done that morning. No notice, no waiting. Just do it." Valerie Granger was absent again, but this time someone else came in her place. Thomas Wendell, who had resigned from his post just 2 hours before the hearing began. When called to testify, he approached with a small USB drive in hand. "I'm tired of staying silent," he said. "This contains all HOA financial records from the past 6 years. And if you need a witness to confirm how Mrs. Granger authorized the demolition of Mr. Whitmore's house, I'll put my name on it." Some people gasped, others wept. Henry simply tilted his head and whispered. "It's time," the applause began, scattered at first and swelling, not because the HOA was collapsing, but because for the first time someone from the shadows had stepped into the light. And behind the pounding gavels in that hearing room, something bigger was forming, the beginning of a criminal case against Valerie Granger. Marcus knew the hardest part was still ahead, but the flame had already spread too far to be put out. And now it wasn't just burning in Woodridge, it was leaping into other towns, other states, wherever. HOAs once operated like untouchable empires. The story of Henry Whitmore was no longer one man's tragedy. It was a warning and a summons. So, in the very first week of the following month, a formal civil lawsuit was filed with the Arapahoe County Court plaintiff, Henry Whitmore defendant. The board of the Woodridge Springs HOA, led by Valerie Granger. On the same day, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation announced the launch of a criminal inquiry into charges of forgery of administrative documents, unlawful property enforcement, and collusion for profit through residential fees. Headlines everywhere began calling it the HOA collapse case, the first major explosion in American history to shake the very foundation of homeowners associations. But alongside the momentum came the backlash. Extremist conservative groups accused the media of fueling hatred against HOA governance, which preserves community order. Some pro-establishment bloggers wrote openly, "Henry Whitmore is no victim. He's a pawn in a campaign to dismantle local autonomy." On social media, two opposing hashtags emerged: #justice for Henry and #defend our HOAs. The nation split down the middle. Valerie's family hired one of the top legal firms in the state known for handling media escalation crises. At the same time, a group of conservative residents in Woodridge held a closed-door meeting and declared they would defend the HOA from political opportunists. They reinstalled restriction signs across public lawns and sent threatening letters to households flying the free HOA flag. One anonymous letter arrived at Marcus's temporary law office set up in Tommy's garage. Written in red ink, it read, "You're playing with fire, and the whole neighborhood will burn with that old man." Marcus read it silently, folded it neatly, and set it beside the draft for a supplemental legal motion. This one requesting an injunction to freeze HOA bank accounts and prevent asset transfer. "They're going to hit back," Tommy said as he walked in holding a coffee can. "They'll do anything to smear." Henry Marcus nodded, his voice low. "I know, and I'm ready." On the desk, he opened a folder. Inside were handwritten notes, journal pages, and letters, all written by Henry over the years. But at the top sat a small, worn notebook, leather-bound and fading brown edges, frayed on the front. "James things I never got to say." It was Henry's personal journal from the day his son enlisted to the day the casualty notice arrived. In it, he documented every video call, every letter, every dream, involving James and the countless nights he sat awake thinking he heard a military vehicle pulling into the driveway. "I don't need him on TV," Marcus said. "I just need people to understand who he is, not through slogans, but through his pain." That night, the local PBS station aired a full-length feature, "The Man Behind the Frame," telling Henry's story, his son's their home, and the dust-covered photograph where Henry is seen smiling, arm around James in a worn military uniform, both looking at the camera as if no war could ever tear them apart. The segment ended with a passage from Henry's journal. Read in his own voice, "You said you hold the house, I'll come back. So I held it. Even when the house was gone, I held it." On social media, someone commented, "I don't know how HOA law works, but I do know this. Anyone who tore down that man's home destroyed something far bigger. Trust." Meanwhile, Valerie launched her counterattack, and her first strike wasn't aimed at Marcus, it was aimed at Henry. A new motion was filed in court accusing Henry of defamation, fabrication of emotional harm, and incitement of public unrest. The filing included a demand that Henry withdraw his lawsuit and be legally prohibited from engaging with the media. The court scheduled the hearing for the following week. On the day of the trial, hundreds of residents packed the plaza outside the Arapahoe County Courthouse. To the left stood the supporters of Henry Whitmore, holding signs that read, "This is not just a house, it's a man's dignity." To the right, the Protect Our HOA group waved banners declaring, Rules keep peace. Emotions don't replace order. Journalists, camera crews, even political TikTokers swarmed the square like it was the premiere of a blockbuster. Marcus and Henry stepped out of the car, walking slowly toward the courthouse entrance. Henry sat steady in his wheelchair, wearing an old suit that Tommy had carefully pressed a worn military ID tucked into his chest pocket, the photo inside showing his son alive and proud. Across the way, Valerie Granger appeared in a pale gray dress and oversized sunglasses that covered nearly half her face. She was flanked by 2 attorneys, a PR handler and a private security guard. While the media called it a man versus the system inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was colder, rigid, procedural, tense, like a drawn bowstring. Presiding was Judge Theodore Barnes, known for his strict discipline and resistance to public sentiment. The defense requested a closed hearing. It was denied. Cameras were permitted under strict conditions, no filming witnesses, no public outbursts. When proceedings began, Valerie's legal team presented a motion to dismiss Henry's case, claiming he had spread misinformation, weaponized public opinion, and caused severe emotional distress to Mrs. Granger and other HOA members. They showed live stream clips, headlines, viral images, arguing that Henry had become a media instrument, exploiting his son's sacrifice to attack a legitimate institution. Marcus didn't interrupt. He studied the panel's reactions in silence, then approached the podium. In his hands, a verified copy of Henry's journal. He gave no speech, made no appeals. He simply held up a photograph of Henry in his wheelchair, surrounded by smoke and rubble, clutching his son's picture, while his house lay in ruins behind him. "They say my client damaged their reputation," Marcus said softly. "But what did they do to his, who here has truly suffered?" For 20 seconds, no one moved, no cough. No shutter click. Just the soft, deliberate tapping of Judge Barnes's pen. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, he said. "We all need a moment to breathe before we decide where justice belongs." Outside on a stone bench, 2 women sat quietly. One a retired elementary teacher, the other a former nurse. Both had been fined by the HOA for displaying prayer flags in their yards. They held each other, tears slipping down their cheeks. "Henry's up there," one whispered, "for all of us." What they didn't know was that in another state, a lawmaker was calling for a nationwide audit of HOA powers. Another had filed a bill. No civil organization may enforce property seizure without oversight by courts or legislative authority. And inside that courtroom in a wheelchair sat a father between conflict, between ideologies in a divided America. Suddenly the question of who was right or wrong didn't matter as much as something deeper. Who gets to define order? And who has the courage to resist it when that order goes wrong? 3 days after the opening trial, Henry Whitmore's personal medical records were leaked on an extremist political forum. The post was titled, "America's Dad," or "A Man Using Illness to Dodge Financial Duty." Attached was an image of a medical report confirming that Henry had once been treated for PTSD and chronic insomnia, long-term effects from his years as a firefighter. Below that were hundreds of vicious comments. Now it makes sense why he couldn't pay his HOA fees. So having a diagnosis means you get special treatment. Now, Marcus slammed his phone down on the table when he saw the post. He had anticipated personal attacks, but not this. Not a blatant violation of medical privacy. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew Valerie's team had gone dirty, and that wasn't even their lowest blow. The next day, an anonymous investigative article appeared in the Centennial Post, a paper with known past financial backing from Valerie's husband, titled "Henry's Son a Hero," or "A Story Built for Sympathy." The piece dissected James's military record, casting doubt on his awarded honors, and even insinuated that he may have once been internally investigated for misplacing equipment. The internet hit back. A former squad mate of James posted on Twitter, "I was there when James carried a shrapnel-hit child back to the aid post. I was there when he refused to leave the scene while bleeding. If anyone wants to insult a fallen soldier's memory just to win a lawsuit, I'll meet you face to face." Within 6 hours, the hashtag #StopSmearing the Dead was trending nationwide. Valerie remained silent. No public response, only a brief statement from her law office, "Mrs. Granger has no involvement in the editorial direction of any articles published by independent media outlets and will not comment on third-party documents." While public outrage intensified, Henry said almost nothing. He simply wrote a short letter by hand and posted it on the Woodridge Community Forum. "I don't need anyone to believe I'm a hero. I just want to live in peace on the land my son promised he'd come home to." That one sentence was printed, laminated, and posted on front doors and windows across hundreds of homes in the neighborhood. it became a quiet act of protest. That same week, Marcus made a risky decision. He released the entire internal HOA email archive to the public, including messages from Valerie discussing accelerated cleanup of problematic residents. He knew it could complicate the legal process, but staying silent would only allow the narrative to be warped further. Then unexpectedly, an ally stepped forward. Forward, the New York Times published an independent expose revealing that over 200 residential communities across the U.S. had used internal enforcement mechanisms similar to HOA evictions without ever involving a court. The title read, "Small Rules, Big Power. When White Fences Hide an Entire System." The article called Henry's case the first true alarm bell, forcing Congress to reevaluate HOA governance. Valerie called the investigation a veiled political attack, and for the first time threatened to countersue the state if further inquiries expanded. Simultaneously, a leaked memo from her legal team revealed that she was in active talks with a DC lobbying group working to push legislative reform in favor of granting HOAs more authority when residents demonstrate financial incompetence. Marcus chuckled when he heard that. "Incompetent," he said to Tommy. They bulldozed his house in the dead of night, and he still managed to stay silent to not turn into some weeping victim. Meanwhile, the ones in power, are the ones running around feeding stories to the press. Then he straightened his tie and grabbed a new file folder. Tomorrow's the next hearing, and this time Valerie has nowhere to hide. "I'm going to ask directly who signed the demolition order, and why was Henry chosen first?" That morning, the courthouse was packed before sunrise. Outside reporters jostled to live stream every moment. Inside, the second hearing in Henry Whitmore's case began, this time with a new witness Marcus had quietly prepared for over a week. Eric Lowell, vice president of the HOA, and the man believed to have signed the demolition order directly. To the shock of the defense, Marcus petitioned the court to summon Eric as a compulsory witness, supported by the internal emails already admitted into evidence. After several tense minutes of back and forth, Judge Barnes struck his gavel. Motion granted. If Mr. Lowell refuses to testify, he will be considered obstructing a legal proceeding. 30 minutes later, Eric entered the courtroom, pale, disheveled, avoiding eye contact. When asked to take the oath, his hands shook so badly he dropped the affidavit. But under the gaze of hundreds of spectators and cameras, he began to speak. "Did you sign the order to demolish Henry Whitmore's home?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Eric replied, voice barely above a whisper. "Was that order signed before all legal documentation had been properly processed?" Marcus continued. The defense moved to object, but the judge motioned for the answer. Eric hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I was directed to do so by Mrs. Granger." Marcus didn't stop, directed to do what she said. Henry was a dangerous symbol, that if we didn't act fast, it would set a bad precedent. She said, "You have to trim the weeds before they reach the fence." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The air felt heavier. A female reporter covered her mouth. An older man shook his head slowly. Eyes closed, Marcus turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request this testimony be entered into the official record and that the court open a criminal inquiry into abuse of power, unlawful incitement to enforce and deliberate destruction of civilian property." Judge Barnes nodded, his voice cutting like steel. "Request approved. This court will prepare a preliminary referral to the district attorney's office." At the back table, Valerie Granger sat like stone. For the first time since the case broke, she showed no poise, no pride. Her hands were clasped tightly beneath the table, her gaze was lost. When the court recessed to document the proceedings, a reporter approached her quietly. "Do you have anything you want to say to Mr. Whitmore?" Valerie said nothing. She rose, removed her sunglasses, turned her back to the room, and walked away without a word. Meanwhile, Henry remained seated at the front row. He didn't smile, he didn't sigh. He simply bowed his head and closed his eyes. Perhaps because, for him, this wasn't a victory. It was truth finally spoken. Even if late, even if painful, even if it cost him a home. That evening, Marcus stood at the ruins of the house now, just jagged concrete and bent steel rods. Tommy walked over and placed a small sign into the ground. "This land is temporarily sealed with conviction." He looked at Marcus. "What now?" Marcus looked up at the sky. "Now we rebuild. Not just with bricks." He paused, but with law, with belief, and with everyone who's ever been crushed and still stood back up. In the distance, a car engine sounded, but not demolition equipment. This time it was the neighbors bringing lumber, folding chairs, and small bouquets. Because from that moment on, everyone knew this wasn't just where an old man lived. This was where something bigger had begun. 1 week after the decisive trial, the vacant land where Henry Whitmore's house once stood was unofficially given a new name by the people Whitmore Grounds. Not a park, not a memorial, but simply land of memory and beginnings. No one formally suggested the name. It just began to appear on flyers on community boards and finally painted in white on the cracked concrete. Henry was still living in a small room behind St. Julian's Church. Every day he visited the old, we sat beneath a patio umbrella and watched neighbors bring bricks, wooden planks and nails, no blueprint, no architect, just shared will. But while the community was healing, Valerie was not backing down. She hired a new law firm and announced a counterclaim for defamation, career sabotage, and severe emotional distress. Meanwhile, a group of former HOA members launched an online campaign under the slogan, "If HOA falls, chaos rises." Their website featured dramatic videos of trash-filled streets, overgrown lawns, and crumbling fences, as if without HOAs, civilization would collapse. Ironically, most of the footage was from neighborhoods completely unrelated to Woodridge. Marcus didn't answer with press releases. He responded with action. Together with Henry, he filed a petition to establish a new community organization called the Meadowlight Community Circle. Not an HOA, no enforcement powers, no fines. Just the ability to propose to vote and to function transparently. The petition came with nearly 400 signatures representing 82% of current residents. The press called it America's first post-HOA model. But what moved the public most wasn't the policy, it was the proposed design for Henry's new house. A hand-drawn sketch by a high school student named Elias Tron. The house included a wheelchair ramp and on the porch a small memorial corner featuring James's photo and a line etched in stone. For those who fell, so the rest could stand. The sketch went viral, trending on Twitter and landing on Reddit's front page. Elias, just 17, was invited to speak on Good Morning America. When asked, "Why design a house for a stranger?" he smiled and said, "Mr. Henry's not a stranger. He's a symbol, and symbols deserve a place to live on." Meanwhile, Valerie's allies began abandoning her. Sharon Wells, who had resigned from the board earlier, issued a public apology, along with an audio recording proving Valerie had planned to convert much of the HOA's assets into commercial developments, turning family homes into retail centers to be sold to an investment firm. Henry had never been the only target. He was just the first. The beginning of a wider campaign to slowly push old residents out and reshape the community to meet modern standards. Valerie's words verbatim from the recording. After that, no one defended her. Even the bloggers who once backed her quietly deleted their posts. But Valerie didn't yield. She hired full-time security, kept to herself, and filed a new lawsuit, this time against not just Henry, but the local government itself, accusing them of enabling disorder. Marcus read the filing and laughed. The more she fights, the more she reveals, and the more she reveals, the clearer it becomes. This was never about order. It was always about control, but Henry didn't laugh. He asked quietly, "Do you think my son would want me to keep fighting, or would he want me to finally rest?" Marcus was silent, then spoke slowly. "Your son fought so others could live in peace. Now it's your turn to live in peace, so others can keep fighting." Autumn arrived, and the maple trees lining the entrance to Woodridge turned a deep red-orange, like quiet victory ribbons draped over the season. On the old lot, Henry's new house was slowly taking shape. Not a mansion, not a monument, just a small wooden home with 2 rooms, a sloped roof, a wide front porch, and a low fence. But every brick, every plank bore someone's name. Neighbors, retired firefighters, even people from as far away as Ohio, Maine, and California. People once pushed out by HOAs, now sending something back to help rebuild trust. Meanwhile, Marcus received notice from the court. Henry's case had officially been elevated to both civil and criminal proceedings at the federal level due to its scale and systemic implications. It was a turning point. The story was no longer just media material. It opened the door for investigations into every HOA with similar operating models, but it also came with danger. Losing at the federal level wouldn't just mean losing land. It could mean the loss of reputation and legal standing for everyone on Henry's side. Marcus understood the risk, but Henry didn't back down. "If I have to lose," he said, "then I'll lose like a father who kept his last promise to his son. My boy kept his word to this country. I'll keep mine to him." Elsewhere, the city of Centennial issued a 90-day moratorium, suspending all HOA operations for mandatory audits, the first time Colorado's state authority had dared challenge the so-called untouchable self-governance model. At the same time, the financial documents provided by Thomas Wendell were gradually made public, from over-limit collection fees to emergency funds used for private gatherings to cleaning contracts worth tens of thousands signed with companies owned by Valerie's niece. A group of independent attorneys labeled it a new form of community corruption, where power didn't come from law, but from silence and passive agreement. For the first time, national outlets asked, have HOAs, once created to preserve order, quietly become unregulated systems of control? In the midst of this storm, Valerie unexpectedly reappeared, her first public presence after nearly a month in retreat, at a private press briefing at her law firm. She looked thinner, her voice lacking its former force. But what shocked everyone wasn't her appearance, it was her opening line. I will not apologize, because I believe I did what was necessary to stop this community from falling apart. What followed was an 18-minute statement in which she claimed Henry's case was a media-manipulated campaign orchestrated by forces trying to dismantle local autonomy. She ended with, I'm ready to stand trial, not to defend, but to prove that being right doesn't always come with applause. The press called it the final speech of someone who refuses to lose. Marcus just smirked. She still thinks this is a battle of pride, but this is a battle about responsibility. That same day, Henry quietly wrote a 7-page handwritten letter and mailed it to Valerie herself. No one saw what was inside. He affixed the stamp himself and dropped it at the local post office. When asked what he wrote, he said, only this: there are things the law can't require us to say, but my son taught me some things must be said not to win, but because they're right. While the nation awaited the coming federal trial in Woodridge, residents set up a small line of flags along the path to Henry's new home. Not national flags, not state flags. These were strips of cloth, each handwritten with a few simple words. We remember for James, never again. And among them, the smallest one, hung lowest but darkest and boldest, carried just 3 words: no more fear. On the day of the federal trial, the hearing took place at the U.S. District Court in Denver. It marked the first time a civil enforcement action by a local homeowners association had reached federal court as a precedent, setting case one with the potential to reshape residential law across the United States. Reporters from dozens of national outlets began lining up at 4 a.m. Protesters from both sides crowded the sidewalks. The atmosphere was taut as wire. For the plaintiff, Henry Whitmore, the legal team was led by Marcus Caldwell, now joined by 3 additional attorneys from a national civil rights organization. The defense, representing Valerie Granger, arrived with a legal force of 10, headed by a corporate lawyer known for defending banking executives during the 2008 crisis. The trial opened with Marcus's remarks, but this time he didn't begin with law. He spoke about James, about the soldier who sent home 17 letters all asking, Hernan, are you eating enough? About the man who never took medical leave, even when wounded, because he didn't want to worry his team. About the house where James once sat fixing a radio with his bare hands, saying, this house is the only place I ever feel safe. Then Marcus paused, opened an old notebook, and read a line Henry had written the day he was notified of his son's death. You kept your word. Now it's my turn. He closed the book. This isn't about a property dispute anymore. This is about integrity. Does an unelected, unsupervised entity have the right to pressure citizens with financial and administrative force? If the answer is yes, then something is wrong at the roots of our democracy. The defense did not attack Henry directly. Instead, they flipped the narrative, portraying Henry as an agitator fueling collective unrest, claiming the community had been swept into a frenzy of uncontrolled emotion. They presented selectively edited clips from speeches portraying Marcus and his team as agents of disorder dressed as virtue. When it was Valerie's turn to speak, she neither cried nor apologized. I have no regrets, she said, because I believe if we let emotion govern the community, we collapse. I upheld a principle that the law must be respected, and if I'm wrong, then it's the price of leadership. Henry was the last to speak. The courtroom fell silent. He took a few seconds to adjust the microphone. His voice was rough, slow, but steady. I used to think I was too old to stand trial, but now I understand age doesn't excuse me from responsibility. I'm not here to reclaim land. I'm here to ask you, if a father can't hold on to a home to remember his son, then what exactly is this country that my son died for holding on to? There was no applause, no reaction, only silence, dense, weighty, the kind that asks questions no one dares to answer. The court recessed. No verdict was issued, but public sentiment was already shifting. Major news networks ran the same headline: "The Henry Whitmore Case, a Reckoning for America's HOA System." Back in Woodridge, families quietly took down their old signs and replaced them with handwritten ones that read, "This land respects its people." Valerie did not exit through the main doors. She left through the service tunnel. Face unreadable. As for Henry, when asked for comment outside the courthouse, he said only one thing: "If I lose, I still carry my son in my heart. But if I win, then my son will live on in the heart of this country." The verdict was delivered after 6 days of deliberation. In a courtroom packed wall to wall, the federal judge read the ruling in a steady voice, calm, unwavering, but every word clear. The court finds that the Woodridge Springs Homeowners Association, under the direction of defendant Valerie Granger, violated the fundamental civil rights of plaintiff Henry Whitmore. The enforcement order, property demolition, and related coercive actions were carried out beyond legal authority. The HOA is hereby ordered to compensate all material and emotional damages, and community governance is to be transferred to a resident elected oversight entity. Valerie was not present at the sentencing. Reports indicated she had resigned, sold her home, and left the state 3 days prior. The media noted that she left a letter behind, but declined to release its contents. Marcus gave no interviews. Instead, he went directly to the hospital where James's mother, Henry's estranged ex-wife, was undergoing late-stage cancer treatment. They had never reconciled. But when she heard her son was named as part of the reason behind national residential policy reform, she gripped Henry's hand and whispered, "He kept his promise, and so did you." 1 month later, Henry's new home was complete. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a quiet afternoon tea, a few close neighbors, and some children planting flowers in the yard. Henry sat on the porch beneath the new wooden beams, gently running his hand across the etched image of James reprinted on wood framed at the front door. Across the lawn, a group of elementary school kids ran past shouting, "Mr. Henry, we put up the sign." Mounted on a white post near the road was the new street marker: "Whitmore Way, a road of memory, where justice begins." The entire community had agreed to rename the main street Whitmore Way. No resolution, no formal vote. They just did it. And when the city received a petition with 300 signatures, they nodded and approved without a single objection. A few weeks later, a special committee in the U.S. Congress formally introduced the Whitmore Act, a proposed bill mandating nationwide review of HOA powers, requiring independent oversight, and banning all property seizures without a formal court order. The bill was still in draft form, but its name had already become a symbol. Henry never appeared on camera again. When invited to speak at a national summit in Washington, he declined. Instead, he sent a short audio message containing just one sentence: "Thank you for listening to a father, not because he mattered, but because his son once gave his life so others could be heard." That day, the entire hall rose in silence for 60 seconds. No one cried. But many couldn't take their eyes off the screen where one sentence lingered. For James, for Henry, for all who stayed quiet too long on the small porch on Whitmore Way. Henry still brewed tea every morning. The wooden chair next to him was always empty. For James, he would say, then he'd tell stories to the children who came to listen. Not about war or law, but about the little sparrow that once built a nest on the old rooftop. About the apple tree he almost cut down, but James had said, "Save it for next season." And about the lesson he always repeated before the kids went home: never let anyone tell you that you don't have the right to hold on to something just because they have more paperwork. Because in the end, Henry didn't just reclaim a house, he reclaimed the right to exist and left behind a road not paved in concrete alone, but in human resolve. Thank you for staying with the story until the very end. If you found it meaningful, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next videos. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and loved ones, because sometimes just one story can move an entire community.